Objective 6. Identify the shape of a distribution. One way that a variable is described is through the shape of its distribution. Distribution shapes are typically classified as symmetric, skewed left, or skewed right. The figures below are going to display various histograms in the shape of the distribution. If we look at figure A and B, the first two figures, it shows symmetric distributions. They are symmetric because if we split the histogram right down the middle, and if we folded the page, the right and left sides are mirror images of each other. Now, if we take a look at the first figure A, this is considered a uniform distribution because the frequency of each value of the variable is evenly spread across the values of the variable. Now, if we take a look at figure B, this displays a bell-shaped distribution. Okay, so let me go ahead and write down what you can see here. Okay, so this is considered uniform because everything is evenly placed there. Now, the bell-shaped is because if you trace this shape here for part B, this creates a bell-shaped distribution because the highest frequency occurs in the middle of the frequencies and it tails off on the left and the right of the middle. Okay? Now, if we take a look at the distribution in C, okay, this is considered skewed right because if we start with our bell-shaped, and you can see that the graph then eventually skews all the way to the right. Okay, and then notice that the tail to the right of the peak is longer than the tail to the left of the peak. And then finally, if we look at figure D, this illustrates a distribution that is skewed left because again, if we take a look here, we can see that it's starting to drop on the left side, and so it has a longer tail on the left side. So it's a distribution that is skewed left because the tail to the left of the peak is longer than the tail to the right of the peak. Now, it is important to recognize that data will not always exhibit behavior that perfectly matches any of the shapes that are in the figures below. Now, to identify the shape of a distribution, some flexibility is required. In addition, people may disagree on the shape because identifying the shape is subjective. Therefore, you should always support the shape of the distribution. Okay, let's go ahead and review A again. The graph is titled uniform, symmetric, and the histogram shows the bars being equal in height for all the values. The vertical axis is labeled frequency, okay, and it lists values from 0 to 30. Okay, so that's the vertical axis, in increments of 5. And the horizontal axis lists the values from 0 to 20 in increments of 2. It's important to recognize each one of these figures. For graph B, the graph is titled bell-shaped symmetric, and the histogram shows the bars being higher for the center values and tailing on either side. The vertical axis labeled frequency lists values from 0 to 60, which are in increments of 10. And the horizontal axis lists the values from 0 to 45, and these are in increments of 5. Okay, if we look at graph C, the graph is titled skewed right, and the histogram shows the bars being higher for the values toward the left and tailing in height towards the right. Now, the vertical axis labeled frequency lists values from 0 to 50 in increments of 10, and the horizontal axis lists the values from 0 to 80 in increments of 10. Okay, and then the last one, we have graph D. The graph is titled skewed left, and the histogram shows the bars being higher for values toward the right and tailing in the height towards the left. The vertical axis is labeled frequency, lists values from 0 to 16 in increments of 4, and the horizontal axis lists the values from 0 to 160 in increments of 20. Okay, now let's take a look at this example here. This is identifying the shape of a distribution. Okay, figure below displays the histogram obtained in a previous example for the 5-year rate of return for large blended mutual funds. We're going to describe the shape of the distribution. Well, first, we can see here that it's titled 5-year rate of return for large blend mutual funds. We can see that the vertical axis is labeled frequency, and the values are listed from 0 to 12. in increments of 2. And we can see that the horizontal axis, okay, is titled rate of return, okay, going from values from 8 to 20, and this is in increments of 2. So if we take a look at this, this sort of forms some sort of bell-shaped situation, okay? So what that means is if we cut this in half, it would mirror approximately the left and right side. Now again, it's not perfect. So because this histogram looks very similar to figure B, then the distribution is going to be fairly symmetric.